Hello and welcome to the Center for Catholic-Jewish Studies Spring 2021 program, The Church and the Jewish People, Thoughts on the Way Forward. My name is Matthew Tapey, and I am an Associate Professor of Theology and the Director of the Center for Catholic-Jewish Studies at St. Leo University, the oldest Catholic institution of higher education in Florida, and one of the largest Catholic universities in the country. The mission of the St. Leo University Center for Catholic-Jewish Studies is to build mutual respect, understanding, and appreciation among Jews, Catholics, and all people of goodwill by providing opportunities for interfaith education and dialogue. Inspired by the Second Vatican Council's new and positive framework for the Catholic Church's relationship with the Jewish people, the center facilitates theological study and dialogue among Christians and Jews at the scholarly level, in the classroom, and in the local community. The center was established in 1998 through joint efforts of St. Leo, the American Jewish Committee, and several principal founders, including Rabbi James Rudin, Dr. Arthur Kirk, former president of St. Leo, Bishop Emeritus John Nevins of the Diocese of Venice, Bishop Emeritus Robert Lynch of the Diocese of St. Petersburg. And given Florida's growing and diverse population, these leaders recognize the need in the state for an academic center devoted to biblical and theological study of Catholic-Jewish relations and interreligious dialogue. The center remains the only academic center of its kind in the Southeast. To many supporters and longtime friends joining us from the Tampa Bay area, we welcome you tonight. And to many who have joined us for the first time, we're really glad you've joined us from across the country in different places where you are. Tonight's program is very special since it kicks off a 3-day online meeting of 14 influential scholars of Catholic-Jewish relations in the United States. For the next 2 days, these scholars will meet online to discuss essays on theological dialogue that they have written over the last several months. Indeed, the planning stages for our meeting began almost 2 years ago. We are excited because this is the first scholarly symposium that the center has put together that will result in a book. The essays these scholars present at the center over the next 2 days will eventually be published and made available to the public. To our supporters, please know your contributions make things like this possible. Your gifts to the center help produce scholarship at the highest levels. And when scholars get a chance to meet like we are over the next several days, it makes a difference because it allows them to listen to one another and to learn from each other so that what they publish can be strengthened and so that the final product is of the highest quality possible. Since iron sharpens iron, scholarly writing and research becomes clearer and more helpful to the world and the public when arguments and ideas can be tested in meetings like the ones we will have. I now want to introduce our esteemed guests, especially our keynote speaker, Dr. Bruce Marshall. I'll then introduce 2 scholars who will respond to Dr. Marshall's talk. Dr. Bruce D. Marshall is Lehman Professor of Christian Doctrine at the Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. He grew up in Michigan, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, receiving his BA from Northwestern University and his master's and PhD from Yale University. He is the author of Trinity and Truth and Christology and Conflict, the editor of Theology and Dialogue. He has published numerous essays and reviews in scholarly journals and chapters in edited volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of the Trinity and the Oxford Handbook of Sacramental Theology. A scholar and teacher in the fields of historical and systematic theology, Professor Marshall's work focuses on the significance of the Jewish people and Judaism for Christian faith and theology, and on Catholic doctrines of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Eucharist, and the relationship between faith and reason. He works extensively on some of the major theologians of the Middle Ages, especially Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus. Professor Marshall is a founding member of the Academy of Catholic Theology, of which he served as president in 2008 to 2009. He has been a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow, a Pew Evangelical Scholars Fellow, and was awarded a Ford Senior Research Fellowship by Southern Methodist University. He is a member of the editorial boards of Nova et Vetera and Pro Ecclesia, 2 academic journals. Dr. Malka Simkovich is Crown Bryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of the Catholic-Jewish Studies program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She is the author of The Making of Jewish Universalism, From Exile to Alexandria, and Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures, and Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, which received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Father Dennis McManus is a priest of the Archdiocese of Mobile and Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, Maryland. Father McManus is a consultant for Jewish affairs at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He also teaches in the Department of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University and has taught Christian theology and Jewish studies for over 40 years. I would now like to turn it over to Dr. Marshall for his lecture, and Dr. Simkovich and Father Dennis for their responses.
Thanks so much, Matthew, for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if here is virtual rather than physical space. I'm very grateful to Matthew and to the Center for the invitation to give this talk, and certainly to all of you who have joined us for the event. I'm grateful as well, certainly, to Dr. Malka Simkovich and Father Dennis McManus for generously offering a response to my talk tonight. My title is The Church and the Jewish People, Thoughts on the Way Forward. Writing to the church at Rome, the Apostle Paul says of the Jewish people, when it comes to election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. That is Romans 11, verses 28 and 29. Since the Second Vatican Council, this biblical statement has become the cornerstone of Catholic teaching on the Jewish people and Judaism. Paul's statement is central to the text, recognized by Catholics and Jews alike as the beginning of a new era in the relationship between the Church and the Jewish people, namely the Declaration on Non-Christian Religions of the Second Vatican Council, known by its Latin name, Nostra Aetate. In the year 2015, the Vatican's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews issued a statement marking the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. The aim of that statement was looking back with gratitude on all that has been achieved over the last decades in the Jewish-Catholic relationship and providing at the same time a new stimulus for the future. Not coincidentally, this statement took as its title the very same words as St. Paul: the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And I'll refer to this text a few times in my talk as simply gifts. Following the lead of this text, gifts, we can identify 4 distinct teachings in Nostra Aetate, section 4. Each of these teachings may be regarded by its inclusion in Nostra Aetate as a constitutive element of Catholic doctrine on the Jewish people and on the Church's relationship with them. Each of these 4, in other words, is essential to what Gifts calls the new direction of the Catholic Church, established by Nostra Aetate. There may be more to the doctrinal content of Nostra Aetate 4 than these 4 teachings. It may contain further essential elements of Catholic doctrine, but my suggestion is that at least the following 4 surely belong to the teaching of Nostra Aetate. The first 3 concern the Jewish people directly, while the 4th does so indirectly, but in a quite important way. So first, the unrevoked covenant. According to Nostra Aetate, God has not revoked his covenant with the Jewish people, the covenant that began with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That covenant remains in place and in force so that the Jews remain God's covenant people. In stating this teaching, Nostra Aetate 4 closely echoes Romans 11:29, quoting Nostra Aetate. God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. Such is the witness of the apostle, that is, of Paul. The truly fundamental character of this teaching about God's abiding covenant with the Jewish people is evident from the fact that Nostra Aetate here picks up and reiterates a teaching already made in Lumen Gentium the year before, Vatican II's dogmatic constitution on the Church, a teaching likewise in Lumen Gentium derived from Romans 11. So Lumen Gentium says, on account of their fathers, this people remains most dear to God, for God does not repent of the gifts he makes, nor of the calls he issues. Subsequent papal teaching since Vatican II, has made fully clear that the statement, God holds the Jews most dear, applies not only to the Jews of the Bible or of some former time, but to the Jewish people today, and by implication until the end of time, to the Jews of every today. As Gifts points out, the phrase unrevoked covenant comes not from Nostra Aetate itself, but from a statement of Pope John Paul II on this matter. To a Jewish audience in Mainz, Germany in 1980, John Paul spoke of, quote, the old covenant never revoked by God, end quote. This language was taken up into the Catechism of the Catholic Church and has become standard, the language of the unrevoked covenant, has become standard in Catholic theological reflection on the Jews and Judaism. John Paul made the same point near the end of his life in a letter to the chief rabbi of Rome, which he was too ill to read in person. He said, you continue to be the firstborn people of the covenant. A second basic teaching of Nostra Aetate 4, a basic element of Catholic doctrine on the Jewish people and Judaism, no collective guilt. Although it did not rise to the level of official doctrine, for centuries Catholics, including Catholic theologians, often taught that the Jewish people as such was condemned by God to exile and servitude for their role in the death of Christ. This teaching could be and was invoked as warrant for the abuse and mistreatment of Jews in Christian societies. Nostra Aetate 4 explicitly repudiates this traditional idea and teaches the opposite. Quoting the text, what happened in Christ's passion cannot be charged against all the Jews then alive, nor against the Jews of today. As a matter of formally defined Catholic teaching, no collective or intergenerational guilt can be ascribed to the Jewish people. Even more basically, it is against Catholic doctrine, according to Nostra Aetate 4, to hold or teach that Jews as such, whether at the time of Christ or today, are under a divine curse or punishment. Quoting Nostra Aetate again, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. 50 years later, Gifts re-emphasizes this teaching. A third fundamental teaching of Nostra Aetate 4, the rejection of anti-Semitism. The Church, in the language of Nostra Aetate, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism, directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. Nostra Aetate offers two distinct reasons for this teaching. One, if you like, more general, and one more particular. On the one hand, it is of a piece, the rejection of anti-Semitism, with the Church's rejection of all racial and religious discrimination. Vatican II teaches that freedom of conscience and freedom from religious coercion are basic rights that flow from the God-given dignity of the human person, rights that no society can justly infringe. Thus, according to Nostra Aetate, the Church reproves as foreign to the mind of Christ any discrimination against men or harassment of them because of their race or religion. On the other hand, and more specifically, the Church's rejection of anti-Semitism is rooted in the unique relationship she has with the Jewish people. The Church decries anti-Semitism because she is, quote, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews, and is moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, end quote. Papal teaching since the Council has repeatedly insisted on this point, as Gifts observes, quoting Pope Francis. The current Holy Father has repeatedly stressed that a Christian can never be an anti-Semite because of the Jewish roots of Christianity. A fourth teaching of Nostra Aetate 4, the universal mission of Christ and the Church. According to Nostra Aetate and other texts of Vatican II, the Paschal mystery, the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, are intended by God for the salvation of every human being. Quoting again Nostra Aetate, as the Church has always held and holds now, Christ underwent his passion and death freely out of infinite love in order that all may reach salvation, end quote. In the context of Nostra Aetate 4, this affirmation of the universality of Christ's saving work is the ultimate reason for the Church's rejection of anti-Semitism. Not the only reason, but the ultimate reason, and is the basis of the spiritual love that Catholics are to have for the Jewish people. Nostra Aetate seems to be saying that no human being, Jew or Gentile, can be treated in any other way than as one for whom Christ died, one who is included in Christ's saving love, and whom he intends that love to reach. For just this reason, the Church is bound to proclaim the gospel of Christ's love to every human being, excluding no person or group from her mission. Nostra Aetate is clear about this, as are a number of other texts of Vatican II. It is, quoting that text again, Nostra Aetate, the burden of the Church's preaching to proclaim the cross of Christ as the sign of God's all-embracing love. Strikingly, this renewed affirmation of the Church's universal mission to proclaim the gospel of Christ stands side by side in Nostra Aetate 4 with the doctrines of the unrevoked covenant, the denial of Jewish guilt, and the rejection of anti-Semitism. As a result, it is not an option for Catholics, and in particular Catholic theologians, to play off these teachings against one another or to choose among them, especially the first three against the last, or conversely. All four must be affirmed without qualification. How to do this in a clear and coherent way is, to say the least, a difficult question, and one far from fully resolved. In varying degrees, all of these four teachings that I've identified of Vatican II and the Papal Magisterium have begun to take root in Catholic life and thought in the decades since the Council. None of these four is entirely novel in the Catholic tradition. The last, the universal mission of Christ and the Church, has been basic to Catholicism from the beginning, as Nostra Aetate says, and the first three on the Jewish people have various precedents in the tradition as well. What is new with Vatican II, and of the highest importance, is that these three teachings on the Jewish people now rise to the level of Catholic doctrine of the Church's official teaching. It should not be supposed, however, that the Church has yet fully understood what these teachings mean, how they fit together, or their import for Catholic belief and practice as a whole. Some Catholics involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue do suggest that the meaning of Nostra Aetate's teaching is quite clear and its implications obvious. So the only question is a practical one, how to get the rest of the church on board. However, if Nostra Aetate 4 marks a profound change in Catholic teaching on the Jewish people and Judaism, as it surely does, then we should expect just the opposite. We should not expect that the implications of this deep change in Catholic teaching will be immediately obvious to us, but that it will take a long time, perhaps centuries, for the Church to discern fully what her own teaching requires of him. Right now, it seems to me the Church is moving slowly and at times painfully toward a deeper understanding of the teaching delivered to her under the guidance of the Holy Spirit by the most recent ecumenical council. It would not be unfair to say that we are groping our way forward to a future for the Church and her relationship with the Jewish people that is not yet clear to us and is not yet close at hand. This is not in any way a criticism, but a sober recognition of what Nostra Aetate, like any significant doctrinal change, inevitably demands of us as Catholics. Gifts, the text from 2015, is very instructive on this point. It combines vigorous clarity about the doctrinal commitments of the Church on the Jews and Judaism, the four teachings I have identified. Vigorous clarity about that with remarkable candor about how much remains unresolved and at present even obscure. This is nowhere more patent than in the paragraphs of Gifts on the necessity of affirming without qualification both God's unrevoked covenant with the Jewish people and the responsibility of Christ's church to proclaim the gospel to every human being. In what can be regarded as something of an understatement, Gifts calls this a highly complex theological question. It is indeed. The task, Gifts lucidly says, is to explain, quote, how Christian belief in the universal salvific significance of Jesus Christ can be combined in a coherent way with the equally clear statement of faith in the never revoked covenant of God with Israel. Difficult as it is, Catholic theology today faces no more important question than this. As the title of our conference suggests, the conference aims at theological dialogue between Catholics and Jews. For Catholics, the Church's relationship with the Jewish people cannot be concerned only with practical and political questions, important as those are, such as the relationship between the Holy See and the State of Israel, to name only one of many important examples. Nor can our relationship with the Jewish people be limited to cooperation and mutual assistance in working amidst all the challenges of the present world for human dignity and social justice, though that too is, of course, indispensable. For Catholics, our relationship with the Jewish people also needs to involve a genuine dialogue of faith. Catholics hope for conversation about the God whom we both love and seek to serve. In other words, a genuinely theological dialogue. Vatican II expresses this Catholic desire, often repeated since then. Quote, since the spiritual patrimony common to Christians and Jews is so great, this sacred synod, the Second Vatican Council, wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect, which is the fruit above all of biblical and theological studies, as well as of fraternal dialogue. 50 years later, Gifts stress the same point. Dialogue between the two, Gifts says, is not a matter of choice, but of duty as far as theology is concerned. The conference is entitled The Challenge of Dialogue, and that needs to be faced, I think, quite seriously. I'd like to conclude these brief remarks by reflecting a bit on what gives rise to the challenges that face Catholic-Jewish theological dialogue from a Catholic point of view. It is well known on both sides that there are what Gifts calls neuralgic theological differences between Jews and Catholics, and these will naturally be difficult to discuss. It is worth considering, though, whether the challenge of contemporary theological dialogue between Catholics and Jews arises not primarily from particular neuralgic points, as from an underlying and quite understandable disparity in what Catholics and Jews hope to gain from this kind of dialogue. Nostra Aetate speaks of mutual understanding and respect as the goal of fraternal dialogue between Catholics and Jews. The language of mutuality is common in Catholic statements on dialogue with the Jews since the Council, and the idea is often present even when the word is not. At one level, this is clearly right. Jews and Catholics alike have good reasons to seek a deeper understanding of each other's tradition. They have to do this in order to present the other tradition to fellow Jews and to fellow Catholics in a just and sympathetic manner, and thereby to foster respect for the other tradition within their own. This stems on both sides, in the first place, from their shared commitment, the shared commitment of Jews and Catholics to the command of Israel's God not to bear false witness. The Church, since Vatican II, has repeatedly stressed the need for Catholics to attain a deeper understanding of Judaism and of the history of the Jewish people, and to do so precisely in dialogue with Jews. In just this way, the Catholic Church hopes to foster among Catholics the respect for Jews and Judaism that her doctrines require. The Catholic Church, however, seeks more from dialogue with Jews than a fair and just appreciation of Judaism, needed and important as that is. Here, I think the language of mutuality may be more misleading than helpful. Nostra Aetate 4 introduces its doctrines on the Jewish people and Judaism by saying that the Catholic Church's spiritual bond with the stock of Abraham, that is, with the Jewish people, is to be searched out and found within the mystery of the Church itself. The Church's relationship to the Jews and Judaism belongs, according to Nostra Aetate, to the Church's own reality and to her own faith. In a statement fundamental for post-conciliar Catholic teaching on the Jewish people, John Paul II explained this passage in Nostra Aetate 4 to his Jewish audience at the Great Synagogue of Rome in his visit of 1986. Quoting John Paul, "The Church of Christ discovers her bond with Judaism by searching into her own mystery. The Jewish religion," he continues, "is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion." This is reaffirmed and quoted in Gifts. I will leave it to the Jewish participants in our conference to say whether they see the relationship described by Pope John Paul from the Catholic side as mutual. Whether, that is, they see Christianity as in a certain way intrinsic to Judaism. However, it would be hardly surprising if they did not see it this way. Rooted in Nostra Aetate, John Paul II holds that the Catholic faith itself and the Church's own identity, or as he puts it, mystery, as the people of God are inseparably bound to the Jewish people and their religion. This is not simply a fact about the historical origins of Christianity that are recognized by all, namely that Christianity comes from Judaism, but is a permanent fact of the Church's life and an ever-present feature of her faith. The Church must seek theological dialogue with Jews. This is an imperative of her own faith and self-understanding. Jews may have many reasons for wanting to talk with Catholics, but an understanding of what it is to be a Jew or of the teachings of Judaism is probably not one of them. Yet this is just the sort of understanding that Catholics hope for in theological dialogue with Judaism. In that conversation, we seek a deeper understanding of what it means to be Catholic, of what it means to be the Catholic Church, and of how the teachings of our own faith hold together. When it comes to theological dialogue, there is an asymmetry, I think, between the situation of Catholics and Jews, a palpable disparity. In a reversal, perhaps a providential reversal, of the historic relationship between the two, Catholics now come to Jews as suppliants. We ask for their help in understanding the unrevoked covenant and their present life as a witness to it. We do so in the hope of groping our way forward in the understanding of our own faith, and especially an understanding of the full import for us of the doctrines concerning the Jewish people and their religion that have only recently been given to us. So far as I can see, our Jewish dialogue partners do not owe this to us, and it is not clear that they have anything immediately to gain from it. In fact, our effort as Catholics fully to discern the consequences of Vatican II's teaching on the Jews and Judaism is likely to take generations. Perhaps we will take a small step or two in that direction at our conference in the coming 2 days. Whether we do or not, as Catholics, we know that we cannot find our way forward without the help of those who are, in the words of John Paul II, our elder and most beloved brothers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We'll now turn it over to Dr. Simkovich for a response.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Matt Tapey for organizing this important event. And I am very grateful to Dr. Marshall for his thought-provoking paper, as well as to Father Dennis McManus for participating in what I know will be a very rich conversation this evening. According to Dr. Marshall, as I understand him, the Church views dialogue with the Jewish people as a theological imperative, but faces two significant challenges in entering into this dialogue. The first is that the notion of the Jews' unrevoked covenant conflicts with the mandate to preach the gospel to all people, and that salvation only takes place through Christ. This challenge can be summed up in the following question: how might the Church reconcile its teaching that all people can only be saved through Christ, and its teaching that the Jewish covenant is unrevoked? The second challenge, which is newer and has yet to be fully investigated by Catholic theologians, concerns how these questions about the Jewish people might impact the motivations for Jewish-Christian dialogue. In Dr. Marshall's view, Christians will always view Jews as part of the Christian story and within a particular Christian framework, whereas Jews will not accept this theological framework. Dr. Marshall views the Church's relationship with the Jews as an immutable reality and takes it as a given that, quote, the Church's relationship to the Jews and Judaism belongs to the Church's own reality and to her own faith. I will sum up this challenge in a way which might question the premise of the assumption that the Church can only view the Jews within a Christian framework by asking the following question. Jews always respond to questions of questions. How should the church relate to the Jewish people in dialogue? Is it possible for the church to view the Jewish people on their own definitional terms and according to their own self-understanding and their own constructed boundaries? Or should the church continue to view the Jews within a Christian framework when it comes to the Jewish covenantal relationship, Jewish salvation, and the boundaries of Judaism? These two challenges, the first about the nature of the Jewish covenant, and the second about the church's ongoing dialogue with the Jews, drive not only Dr. Marshall's reflections, I think, but the very essence of the gifts and calling itself. The challenges arise out of 2 millennia of internal conversations about the Jewish people and their relationship with God and Christians, and of being faced, for the first time in Christian history, with the opportunity to engage in formal and systematic dialogue with Jews about the Jewish people and their relationship with God and Christians. Speaking with Jews rather than talking about Jews offers the church a chance to pivot. When speaking about the Jewish people, the church has naturally spoken of the Jewish people as filling a symbolic function on the Christian stage. Speaking with the Jewish people, however, presents the church with an opportunity to encounter Judaism as an organism unto itself, an ongoing enterprise which exists and evolves outside of Christianity, a religion with theological meaning outside of its relationship to the church. It seems to me that Dr. Marshall's statement that the church only encounters Judaism on Christian terms and only can encounter Judaism on Christian terms might not accommodate this new model in which the church is speaking in explicitly positive terms with and not only about Judaism. The gifts and calling likewise presumes that Jews can be defined and understood in a Christian theological context, and that at its essential core, Judaism can be fully understood in relationship to Christianity. As a reflection of both an internal theological debate, that is, a conversation about Jews, and as a reflection of self-conscious, external, interreligious conversation, that is, a conversation with Jews. The gifts and calling struggles with both challenges that I've outlined. The first challenge regarding how to reconcile the tension between the mandate to evangelize and the doctrine that the Jewish covenant is alive and well. And the second challenge regarding how to define, relate to, and dialogue with the Jewish people. The ambiguity in church documents, like the gifts and calling, when it comes to how Christians should understand, define, and encounter Judaism, does not, I think, present us with a disadvantage, but a significant opportunity for us at this moment. Just 56 years after Nostra Aetate was published, there is still flexibility to think about how to interpret it in a very practical sense and try to shape what it means for the church to have a relationship with the Jewish people. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes, therefore, is consider how to put these two questions, the first about how the church theologically interprets Jews and Judaism, and the second about the church's relationship with Jews and Judaism, into conversation with one another, and then suggest a possible solution that might be, I hope, acceptable to both Jews and Christians. The Jewish origins of Jesus and the Jesus movement makes it necessary, of course, for the church to properly understand the nature of the Jews' relationship with God and with Christians. But as Dr. Marshall acknowledges at the end of his talk, Jews view the process of defining who the Jewish people are through Christian interpretations of the covenant and salvation as a denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination and to dignity. As Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik has noted in his argument outlining the risks of theological interreligious dialogue, even positive definitions of the Jewish people can be problematic for, quote, the mere appraisal of the worth of one community in terms of the service it has rendered to another community, no matter how great and important this service was, constitutes an infringement of the sovereignty and dignity of even the smallest of faith communities, end quote. The gifts and calling seeks to confer dignity onto the Jewish people in other ways. It recognizes the Jews as participants in a living covenant in a public document, which celebrates the beginning of the church's reconciliation with the Jewish people. Nevertheless, its effort to define the Jews in relation to Christianity might compromise the dignity of the Jewish people. What's more, the gifts and calling does not simply define Judaism within a Christian framework. It seems to me that it defines Judaism as the ontological opposite of Christianity, and it does not interrogate the premise that the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is predicated on their differences. It mentions, for example, the universalism of Christianity 15 times, almost entirely in contrast with the particularism of Judaism. The treatment of Judaism as the ontological opposite of Christianity is so embedded into the gifts and calling that even its discussion of the mutual benefits of Jewish-Christian dialogue presumes Jewish particularism. Paragraph 35 closes with a declaration that in the process of Jewish-Christian dialogue, Jews can, quote, arrive at the insight that Israel without the church would be in danger of remaining too particularist and of failing to grasp the universality of its experience of God. In this fundamental sense, Israel and the church remain bound to each other according to the covenant and are interdependent, end quote. That Jews can realize the limits of their own particularism through engaging in interreligious dialogue reflects, I think, a particularly Christian, or at least non-Jewish, characterization of Judaism. Even Jewish theologians like Wishograd, who embrace aspects of Jewish covenantal particularism, would, I think, agree that Judaism contains universalist elements which complement the notion of Jewish election. Personally, I would go so far as to argue that the absence of a Jewish mission in the Hebrew Bible and in rabbinic literature, and the simultaneous belief that all people can be saved, whether Jew or non-Jew, might represent a more universalist outlook than the position that salvation is only available to those who believe in Christ. And yet, I would not deny the church's right to understand itself according to its universalist mission. The presumption that it is inevitable that the church will view Judaism in Christian terms, therefore, takes on considerable risk that the church will do so by defining Judaism as the ontological opposite of Christianity, unless it takes intentional, self-conscious steps not to. To sum up my points so far, when it comes to the second challenge noted by Dr. Marshall regarding the church's view of Judaism within a Christian framework, I would suggest that this view almost always depends upon a Christian definition of Judaism and Jewish boundaries through exclusively Christian or non-Jewish notions of universal truth and salvation, and serves to affirm its long-standing position that Judaism functions as the particularist opposite of Christianity. By adopting this model, therefore, the church risks denying Jews of the dignity that is so necessary for interreligious engagement, particularly when its definition of Judaism is misaligned with Jewish self-understanding. Interestingly, the Gifts and Callings closing section regarding the benefits of interreligious dialogue focuses on common values which can bring Jews and Christians together, creating, I think, yet another tension, this time between the assumption that Jews and Christians will find common moral ground in interreligious dialogue and the assumption that Judaism is the ontological opposite of Christianity. In paragraph 46, the Gifts and Calling states that Jews and Christians should embrace the, quote, joint engagement throughout the world for justice, peace, conservation of creation, and reconciliation, end quote. This section focuses on common values and consequently common activism, pivoting away from the foundational differences which distinguish Christianity from Judaism and not addressing how Jews and Christians might work towards the same goals from opposite theological ends. Ultimately, the Gifts and Calling does not extract itself, I think, from pre-Second Vatican Council attitudes that Jews and Christians operate in existential conflict. basing itself on a definition of Judaism which stands in opposition to Christ, not only in the Jewish rejection of Christ as Messiah, but also in the Jewish embrace of particularist thinking, it concludes that its set task to reconcile how the Jewish covenant is not broken, and that at the same time, salvation is accessible only through Christ, cannot be solved by humans. Instead, the document concludes that the fact that, quote, Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable, but how that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains an unfathomable divine mystery. At first glance, mystery seems like a frustrating way to end this document, especially after going through the process of defining the Jewish people in Christian terms. For some, mystery suggests that there is a cosmic contradiction which derives from divine authority and is dispatched vertically down to humans who cannot fully understand its reality. Mystery is the locked door at the end of the corridor, the last stop on the train before we head home in defeat. And yet, mystery can invite believers to engage in an admirable act of humility and withdrawal. Mystery can also be positively defined as knowledge about ourselves and God that we do not yet understand, but that is possible for us to discover through prayerful study and searching, as Dr. Tapie has recently noted to me, which is a comment that I'm very grateful for. Mystery can invite Christians to disengage not only from the question of Jewish salvation, but also from relational questions regarding how to enter into dialogue with Jews and how to define Judaism in connection to the church. If the church can apply the concept of mystery to the irreconcilable facts that the Jewish covenant isn't broken and that salvation is accessible only through Christ, and invite Christians to humbly withdraw from trying to comprehend how both of these statements are true, then perhaps the church can also apply the concept of mystery, that is, humility and withdrawal, to its understanding of how Jews and Christians should relate to one another in dialogue, and how the Jews might exist on their own theological terms with God, squarely outside the realm of Christianity. This maneuver, which would allow Jews to set the terms of their boundary making, would also allow us to employ the notion of mystery as making a space for the conferral of dignity. And the conferral of dignity would invite the church to recognize and apply Jewish self-understandings to its own teachings. The church's theological withdrawal from questions regarding Jewish salvation, how the Jewish people exist on their own theological terms with God, and the church's dialogical relationship with the Jews, would thus imbue the Jewish people with a dignity that comes with regarding the Jews as more than actors on the Christian stage. Dialogue with Jews, rather than discussions about Jews, which would consequently emerge from such withdrawal, would depend upon the conferral of dignity as its starting premise. And this dialogue could bring us into the next stage of a relationship, which would be marked not by theological interconnection, but by spiritual friendship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malka. I would like to, at this time, give a prompt to our attendees. If you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to jot those down, make notes in the Q&A feature of the Zoom and send those along to us, and we'll consider them in the question and answer session. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we will try to answer your questions. So if you have thoughts, questions you'd like to share with our panelists, please do send those. I'll now turn the microphone, if you will, over to Father McManus.
Thank you, Matthew. Professor Marshall from Southern Methodist University has offered in his address a brief and insightful summary of the major points of Vatican II's seminal statement Nostra Aetate, and then drawn out for us several cogent implications of it for both the content and relational dynamics of Catholic-Jewish dialogue. His succinctness in digesting Nostra Aetate's essential points moves us quickly into a discussion about their application to existing dialogues, with a particular emphasis on the Catholic premise that conversation with Jews must at some point be properly theological. That is, it must regard our relationship with God through shared faith and ethical imperatives. Marshall is keen to emphasize what he sees as a significant doctrinal change in Catholic teaching on Jews and Judaism inherent to Nostra Aetate. He wisely observes that such changes may take decades to be fully understood, let alone become transformative of a 2,000-year relationship fraught with a conflict of every sort. At doctrinal ground zero, Marshall identifies this central question for the Catholic tradition, citing its December 2015 expression in Gifts, quote, "How Christian belief in the universal salvific significance of Jesus Christ can be combined in a coherent way with the equally clear statement of faith in the never revoked covenant of God with Israel." It's in light of this central concern in Marshall's view that Catholic-Jewish dialogue must allow itself to become at least as religious or theological as it may need to be in order to find together an answer to this very distinctly Christian question. At the same time, he's shrewd to ask whether this matter is of equal or of any concern to Jewish partners, introducing an unanswerable question outside of dialogue itself. Marshall adds to the urgency of this task by citing John Paul's elegant statement in his visit to the Synagogue of Rome, a first step in his papacy's efforts at teshuvah with the Jewish community, that, quote, "The Church of Christ discovers her bond with Judaism by searching into her own mystery. The Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a way intrinsic to our own religion." In short, the Catholic impetus for dialogue with Jews reaches far beyond the well-known boundaries set by Joseph Soloveitchik in his famous 1964 essay, Confrontation. There, Rev. Soloveitchik allows Orthodox Jews to dialogue with Christians only about the Holocaust, the security of Jews in the state of Israel, or of issues of common concern in the public square. Theological conversation is to be avoided because of the Christian mandate to proselytize, convert, and baptize all people, Jews included. As such, Soloveitchik's prohibition is understandably self-defensive, signaling from the outset that the impetus for Christian self-discovery as a byproduct of Catholic-Jewish dialogue cannot be trusted. Marshall concludes by noting the resultant asymmetry in dialogues constructed in the way that Paul VI Nostra Aetate and subsequent popes might suggest. Most of all, he sees that a reversal of historical roles would now have suppliant Christians asking Jews for help in coming to terms with their own self-discovery as Nostra Aetate has encouraged it. Jews, he adds, do not owe this function to Christians, and it risks widening further the distance between intention and encounter in each dialogue setting. Marshall's insights are very helpful in orienting the Christian compass for dialogue with the wide range of Jewish expression found today. At the same time, Marshall's methods raise three critical questions in response, which may serve to broaden an appreciation of what, in fact, Nostra Aetate was hoping to achieve and how its implementation may proceed. First, could the text of Nostra Aetate 4 separate out actually 5 rather than 4 important interrelated points that form its deep structure? The order of their appearance in the text also seems significant, as it implies a cause and effect relationship, at least between the 3 repudiations which come toward the end. To begin, Nostra Aetate's 4th section offers its reader some 5 subparagraphs that help to contextualize the historically critical statements that are to follow. The chief theological teaching, which works like a major premise to the balance of section 4, can be found in the middle of the 4th subparagraph. And it reads, quote, "God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues." In short, Catholic tradition is retrieving a very Pauline understanding of 1st century Jewish Christianity, namely that the following of Jesus, a Jew, is not separated from his Judaism, but emerges from it, aware of its divine origins and the unshakable love of God that ever suffuses it. It is this great premise which then enables Nostra Aetate to safely venture out into self-criticism, doing so on solid biblical grounds, even if exegeted otherwise for centuries prior. Almost by way of introduction to the list of its 3 repudiations, the document abruptly shifts gears from its theological summary and turns from theological to the dialogical task at hand. It reads at this point, since the spiritual patrimony common to Christians and Jews is thus so great, the Sacred Synod wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect, pardon me, which is the fruit, above all, of biblical and theological studies, as well as of fraternal dialogues. Only then does the text offer 3 stunning clarifications of Catholic belief and expression regarding Jews, Judaism, and the death of Jesus. Prime among these, of course, is the repudiation of the deicide charge. In these words, quote, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today. In short, neither can there be any collective guilt for the death of Jesus attributed to Jews then or now. The second repudiation follows on the heels of the first, that the Jews should not be presented as rejected or cursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. Here we see Nostra Aetate's next historically urgent point, that, quote, the teaching of contempt, unquote, a phrase coined by Jules Itzhak, has no basis in biblical fact or interpretation. Third and last of the repudiations that follow is the condemnation of any form of anti-Semitism, no matter its context or intention. The Church, Nostra Aetate states, quote, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. Then, as if both to accuse and correct its own past expressions to the contrary, Nostra Aetate strikes at the heart of anti-Judaism with its sanating realization expressed, but now in soteriological terms. Quote, besides, as the Church has always held and holds now, Christ underwent his passion and death freely because of the sins of men and out of infinite love, in order that all may reach salvation. Just as Marshall has so keenly observed, the rhetorical position of this last statement is meant to seal off the entire theological discussion from any further possibility of separating Jews from the saving action of God, either through the covenant of Moses or that of Jesus. In the first and fifth of these points, we're meant to hear the echo of a theology of inclusivity for Jews in the divine plan of creation and redemption, a place denied to them by the historical canards that Nostra Aetate's repudiations have now targeted. Considered in this way, we can see that these 5 points give rhetorical form to a compelling argument, that God alone determines the course and limits of his saving acts, leaving out no one, most especially the Jews through whom he has begun and will fulfill his plan of salvation. The second major question raised by Marshall's text is whether or not Nostra Aetate in fact introduces a doctrinal change in Catholic teaching, or rather finally recognizes a theology of Jews and Judaism that has always been present in her tradition, but as it were in a minor key. For example, while there's always been a strong voice such as Augustine's in his Contra Faustum, to see Jews through the lenses of the very repudiations that Nostra Aetate has rejected, there is also a stubborn minority expression to the contrary, as in the theological method of Aphrahades of Persia and his exegesis of Jewish texts, or in Bernard of Clairvaux's defense of the Jews as the apple of God's eye in the middle of the Crusades, moving us into the risky and innovative moves of Aquinas himself in his commentary on Epistle to the Romans, where, contra to many scholars in his own day and ours, Thomas corrects an habitual misreading of the place and contribution of Jews in the plan of salvation. Could these few examples and many others suggest that Nostra Aetate was not a doctrinal change, but a correction of the general expression about Jews and Judaism, an expression already well documented in the tradition, but for many political and social reasons, made unable to compete with the widespread anti-Judaism of liturgy and pulpit? Might we borrow here a term from the Council's own statement on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which demands that changes in our expression be a result of organic growth rather than assimilation? Can this simple rule be applied to the statements of Nostra Aetate to expose many of the mainline anti-Jewish expressions as, in fact, inauthentic to the oldest and truest of Catholic beliefs? Third and last is to pose a question to Professor Marshall about why the Church has felt the need at all to seek out her identity as she peers into the great mystery of Judaism. A partial answer to this question is that Nostra Aetate could not have been imagined without the Holocaust having culminated the most destructive of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic movements in Western history. In effect, the Holocaust and its trauma to the Jewish people have also deeply affected the Church and in turn Catholic-Jewish relations today, forming an under-researched aspect of the background of Nostra Aetate as a properly post-Holocaust document. Marshall rightly asks into the effects of Nostra Aetate's teachings and repudiations on the shape of dialogue. But if we were to see how Nostra Aetate can be effective, must we not do what John Paul did in linking Nostra Aetate's text with public expressions of teshuvah for Catholic anti-Judaism that was a necessary but not determinative cause of the Holocaust? In other words, must we not always acknowledge that for our Jewish colleagues, the Shoah is the silent partner at every Catholic-Jewish dialogue, and it will remain so until the mystery of its still unfinished purpose has been laid bare? If there is any theological premise on which the Church may request dialogue with Jews, it must include the Holocaust and its effect on relations between the two communities. Professor Marshall is again to be thanked for his many insights, as well as his intuitive sense of locating the major points the Catholic-Jewish dialogue must address. Perhaps his most poignant contribution is to see how dialogue is a function of relationality, complete with its wounds, its hope for reconciliation, and the thrill of new identities derivative of mutual rediscovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Dennis. We'll now turn it back over to Bruce, if you happen to have any comments. We also have a question in the queue as well, so it looks like there's much to talk about.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks very much both to Dr. Simkovich and Father McManus for your very thoughtful responses. I want to just say a word or two about what Dr. Simkovich said, because I think it really gets to, and there's much we could talk about, but it really gets to a very fundamental question. Are Catholics only trying to understand the Jews in Catholic terms? I don't think so. That was not my intention. But it keeps coming across that way, right? I mean, that is a sort of fundamental difficulty that Jews perceive whenever they sit down to talk to Catholics, because Catholics have a certain, at least some assumption, including assumptions shaped by Nostra Aetate and subsequent developments, as Father Dennis underlined. Catholics have some assumptions about the Jews and their place in the history of salvation, which Catholics think of as fundamentally positive in the strongest way. And and yet strike our Jewish colleagues and interlocutors as questioning the dignity and self-definition of the Jews. So I guess what I would say, and I want to put this as sort of as directly as I can, the key line in the talk, and probably Dennis picked up on this, is at the end where I say we come to our Jewish dialogue partners as suppliants who ask for their help in understanding our own faith. And what that means, I think, is that we have to understand Judaism in Jewish terms so that we can understand the teaching of our own faith about God's covenant with the Jewish people and about the place of the Jews in salvation history. So I don't see it as an either or. Either we understand the Jews on their own terms or we understand them on our terms and therefore not on their terms. We will, of course, in the end, as Catholics, have a Catholic view of things, just as Jews have a Jewish view of things, including a Jewish view, or views, of course, multiple views, of Catholicism and Christianity. But we want that view to be based on precisely an appreciation of the self-definition of those whom we seek to have dialogue with. It's one of the things where it seems so clear that to me, as I write this and think about it, that that's what I'm trying to do, and yet it comes across, you're not the first to respond to me or to other Catholics in this conversation in the way that you did, Dr. Simkovich, because this seems to, when it doesn't just seem, clearly evokes a different sort of sense from the Jewish listener than it does from, or than is intended by the Catholic proposer. Okay? And so one thing that I think really we need to think and talk about is what's going on here. Why, for Catholics, I think it's certainly just really fundamental to try and understand why coming as suppliants seems like a denial of self-definition to those to whom we are making supplication. If you see what I'm driving at here. So that's my really, I mean, a lot of different things I could comment on in relation to both of your responses, but that to me is the really fundamental point that requires a lot of further spiritual friendship, as you said at the end of your talk.
Would it be possible to answer briefly?
Absolutely. Please feel free to, Malka.
It is curious to me. First of all, thank you very much for those comments. And I do wonder why Jews engaging in this kind of theological dialogue are hearing it in such a way where they're not setting the terms of their self-definition. And so I do wonder how the church can move forward by defining the nature of Judaism beyond what Judaism has rejected. And one thing that I'm thinking about is I wonder, and I'd like to know what you think about this, is whether there is, this has something to do with the fact that when church leaders today and over the past 2 millennia are thinking about Judaism, they're encountering it through the first century texts that are pre-rabbinic. And so to encounter the world of Judaism in the first century is not to encounter it fully in the way that Jews might think about it today, which would be through sort of the formation of what we'd call normative rabbinic Judaism, which sometimes seems to be, put aside in theological conversations about Judaism as it existed in the first century. Rightly so, there was no rabbinic Judaism, I don't think, in the first century. But I guess the question is, do you think that encountering sort of it's very important to situate Jesus in his Jewish first century context, but then is a byproduct of doing so the fact that in encountering living Judaism, you're not thinking about how rabbinic Judaism was involved in the formation of normative Jewish thinking. And so I'm trying to think about whether there's a relationship there, because I don't have answers. I have a lot of questions, but I do think that Jews are hearing it the way that you describe, which is that however the church means to, very respectfully engage with Judaism, there is still a sense on the Jewish end that there is some definitions of Judaism that misalign with Jewish self-understanding. And I think that this is a very understudied question. And I think it deserves a lot of careful thought.
Yeah. Can I just briefly say something with that, Matthew? No, thanks very much for that. There's certainly something to what you suggest. I think from a Christian point of view, it's a bit more like this, that these first century pre-rabbinic texts written by Jewish followers of Jesus have a supremely normative status for us. Of course, we have to understand them historically, no question about that, but our understanding of them can't be limited to that. And so it's a kind of natural thing, if you like, that Christians are going to look at things, and particularly things that are discussed quite explicitly in their scriptures, in the terms that are proposed by those scriptures. Now, not always adequately. And as Father Dennis very helpfully pointed out, a striking feature of, say, Thomas Aquinas' exegesis of Romans, his line-by-line exegesis, is simply how carefully he reads the text and how he recognizes the presence of an unrevoked covenant. He doesn't use exactly that language, but it's quite clear that that's what he's saying. The presence of an unrevoked covenant in Paul's teaching, okay? Which is, of course, not always been recognized by Christian readers of Paul. So we're reading these first century texts, as scripture and not simply as historical sources for the Christian movement, and that's inevitably going to have a different, give it a different cast. I agree with what you said about gifts. This is a sort of subpoint of our discussion. I think I winced when I read the line about Jewish particularism. I've learned a lot from Michael Wishgrad, and I recognize the importance of both aspects, right? So, of course, this is precisely why, as I suggest, we come to our Jewish partners, our Jewish spiritual friends, in the hope of correcting these kinds of misunderstandings. It might be worthwhile to observe that, I think Gifts is a very valuable text, but it also has some problems. And it's a text that is very explicit in its own preface that it is not a statement of Catholic doctrine. It is offered as a theological reflection to further the conversation. Whereas Nostra Aetate is a statement of Catholic doctrine. And there's it's much more sort of limited in what it says, but what it says is of great and fundamental importance. And Nostra Aetate doesn't say really, as Father Dennis can correct me if he reads it differently, but Nostra Aetate doesn't say anything about the content of Judaism. It doesn't say anything about the Jewish religion, except that Christians have to understand that they can't view the Jews as cursed, they can't be anti-Semites, right? But I read Nostra Aetate then as simply opening up the question for Christians and the subsequent Catholics and the subsequent documents of the CRRJ on this are very clear. Now we have to begin the enterprise of seeking an understanding of Judaism in dialogue with Jews that will begin to fill in what we affirm but don't discuss or elaborate on in Nostra Aetate. I didn't mean to take quite so much time, but your comments are really helpful and stimulating. So,
Thank you. Thanks. That was very helpful.
I have one question here that I thought I would try to translate some of it for you all. Anyone on the panel, feel free to try to tackle it. Would not viewing the mystery as God joining true Jews and believing Gentiles into one body, the church, solve the theological issue you are dealing with? I think, Bruce, in some ways, this reminds me of your line that this is not the solution, this is the problem. might be helped to kind of unpack maybe that idea for this attendee we have, this attendee question.
Well, all right, Matthew, thank you. Since you invited me, I'll say a word or two, but I very much want to hear also what my two colleagues might have to say about this. So when Paul speaks of the Jewish people in Romans 11:28 and 29, the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. These people are beloved for the sake of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from whom they are descended according to the flesh. It's very clear that that's what Paul is saying, says it quite explicitly in Romans 9. He's speaking of those who have not entered into the church. So they've rejected Christ, and yet they remain most dear to God in the language of Nostra Aetate. And they are beloved for the sake of the patriarchs. The covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has been inherited by them, and the love that God has for the fathers of Israel, God has for them. So that, yeah, as Matthew put, I mean, that's the problem, right? So how do we now as Christians relate, obviously a lot has happened since Paul wrote those lines, but how do we relate as Christians to that ongoing reality of a church, which certainly always has included some Jews, a very small number in some periods of time, but always has included some Jews, but a church to whom the vast majority of the Jews who are beloved of God, according to St. Paul, remain outside of the church.
Father Dennis, do you have any comments on that? Or Malka, feel free to jump in. This looks like our last question for the evening.
Okay, well, if I may add one thing. To look at the literature on the theology of dialogue itself is one thing, but to go to dialogues and hear the theological reflection of dialogue in action is quite another. It's taken us 50 some years since Nostra Aetate to produce quite an impressive moment. It is the dialogue between Pope Francis and his friend Rabbi Avi Skorka of Buenos Aires. They have a television show about it and a book on heaven and earth and all the rest of it. It goes way beyond what we are chatting about here and simply says, we have mutually discovered this premise. Dialogue between us is impossible unless we allow two things to happen. One is my partner must be allowed to define themselves from within themselves. And I have to accept that. The second thing is I must be open to the transformative effect of mutual exchange, encuentro, the South American term, so that my identity also may change in relationality with the identity of my partner. This is way beyond Nostra Aetate, way beyond gifts even. The experienced reality of a pope and a rabbi is that a dialogical theology of encuentro and relationality rewrites many of the rules that we might have become used to in self-definition. It's a beautiful moment.
Thank you, Father Dennis, for your comments. So I think perhaps because I mentioned last question, folks are sending some more. So thank you for your questions, friends. We have one here that asks, I wonder how Dr. Simkovich would respond to a Hindu, say, who requests that he be viewed as he understands himself and not under the Jewish category of Noahide. In other words, is what Dr. Simkovich is asking of Catholics possible in principle?
There are a lot of angles with which to tackle this good question. And I will note that we have some attendees tonight who have written, the book literally on questions. David Novak has written on natural law and Noahide laws and how Jews perceive themselves vis-a-vis all of humanity. And Dr. Alan Brill has written specifically on Hinduism. So there are certainly experts in the audience this evening whose scholarship I would direct you to. But just on one foot, as the rabbis say, I do not think that Jewish theology or rabbinic thinking contends with the non-Jew in the way that Christianity contends with Judaism, because I think the existence of Judaism and the existence of Jews poses a very profound problem for Christianity, or at least for the church fathers of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. And so that is, we're not talking about Christian attitudes towards Gentiles, right? So it's actually not analogous the way that you're speaking. We're speaking about Christian theology contending specifically with Judaism, and I do not see an analog for that urgency, that urgent contending to solve internal theological problems within the Jewish community. I do not see an analogous parallel. So of course, every religion has to think about itself vis-a-vis humanity and humankind. And Judaism, like other religions, has a universalist outlook of how, which contends with the question of how do all people, how might they all achieve salvation? But beyond that, there isn't much in the rabbinic world of theology thinking about the ins and outs of how the Noahide law system works. Natural law is a different thing. And like I said, I recommend that you read the scholarship of David Novak on that. And I would also say the voluminous amount of adverse socio-Judaism literature that is produced in the early centuries by the church fathers is polemical and doesn't reflect a reality on the ground. This literature tries to create boundaries because in reality, the boundaries have not yet been set. The parting of the ways doesn't happen until the 4th century or maybe even later. So I think it's very useful to think about who is setting these boundaries and on whose terms. So one red flag that comes up for me is when I read Christian theological writings that suggests that the boundaries around Judaism are more porous than Jews are suggesting. In other words, what is a Jew? Can we call someone who believes that Jesus is the Messiah a Jew? And these boundaries sometimes I find are more porous in the Christian theological space. And the question is whether that should be an issue, whether that's a problem. I think it might be. Anyway, this is a very complicated and complex question, but the short answer is I do not see an analog between how Jews employ the Noahide laws and how Christians relate to the Jewish people. I don't see that as extremely useful.
Thank you, Malka, very much for your answer. I am very grateful for all of you coming together tonight online after at the end of the day here. I want to let you know that tonight's program was recorded and it will be added to the Center for Catholic-Jewish Studies YouTube channel. It'll be used by members of our community, other universities to help stimulate classroom dialogue, especially students of St. Leo University's World Religions courses and our graduate course in History and Theology of Catholic-Jewish Relations. So please know that you can rewatch the program. You could also share it with others. It will be online after we complete the editing of the recording. It's been a pleasure to have you as our online guests, and I wish you all the best. I want to thank Father Dennis McManus for joining us this evening, Dr. Malka Simkovich for also giving us of your time, and especially to Dr. Marshall for his keynote lecture for our conference. We have much to talk about in the next few days, and Dr. Marshall has set us off, I think, in a very strong direction. Thank you very much for joining us, and good evening.